There are people all around the world in every walk of life who collect and analyze information in an effort to keep themselves and others better informed and prepared. They are part of a profession, a discipline, a calling, a community, an industry, a bureaucracy, an enterprise. They practice a tradecraft, offer a decision advantage, and provide a public good. Their work is hidden behind classification banners, secure facilities, compartmented clearances, and big institutions with vast resources and capabilities. What they do impacts our everyday lives. This is intelligence. Welcome to the podcast.
Today's guest is Itai Shapira. He is an academic and consultant who served for more than 25 years with the Israeli Defense Intelligence. He has a PhD in intelligence studies from the University of Leicester, and he's the author of Israeli National Intelligence Culture, Problem Solving, Exceptionalism, and Pragmatism, an excellent book that I recommend you all get. Shapira, thank you so much for being here today. Our goal is to compare Israeli and American intelligence cultures, but I think that before we begin, we have to define the term intelligence culture. What does that mean? Some academics define it in very broad terms, part of a national strategic culture for defense and security. That usually turns into a discussion of decision-making processes, institutional relationships, and others define it in more specific terms as a reaction to historical events or as an effort at crafting a self-image. Naturally, there's a lot more discussion of politics in that approach. All of these things can be true depending on how you look at it. In your work, which I love, you cite Raymond Williams very early on, who I also cite in my work, that culture is a concrete world of beliefs and values. And you also cite Clifford Geertz, that culture is a set of concepts whose connections are manifested in language. And you put those two things together, as you do. And what you arrive at is this idea that intelligence culture is a social construct, and it's shaped and structured by the people who are engaged in it. And now we're in the world of constructivism. So, my question to you to start us out is this. Should we think of intelligence culture as a matter of the institutions and processes? Or is it about the mindsets and outcomes? Or is it some combination of both of these things?
I think, first of all, once again, thank you for speaking with me tonight. I think that it's the combination of both. I was very much inspired. I started, by the way, my academic studies about strategic culture research and Israeli strategic culture, and I was very much influenced by strategic culture research. And I think what I found out in strategic culture research, and I tried to apply it to intelligence culture, is that strategic culture and intelligence culture is a combination of both actions and beliefs, both ideas and practice. And as you mentioned, we are in the world of constructivism, meaning that this is a social construct. It does not have an ontological existence such as this computer, for instance. It is shaped by individuals, but it also shapes individuals. So I think what I came up in my book, in my attempt to find national intelligence culture, and I'm also very much influenced by the philosophy of Wittgenstein. So my belief is that even if we cannot clearly define term, definition is the practical use of the term. So even if we cannot reach a very, very concise and clear and robust definition of intelligence culture, we know what we mean when we say intelligence culture, and we know how to use this term. And by the way, perhaps we'll talk about this later. If you look about the Israeli intelligence lessons from the colossal failure of October 7th, many of them discuss culture, not necessarily the way I would define culture, but they do. So relating to this first question, and perhaps you have a different perspective, I think it is both the mindsets and the beliefs, but it also the practices. And practices in the real world are conducted by individuals in organizations and institutions. This is why I thought that intelligence culture is some sort of national convergence of strategic culture, political culture, and of course, organizational culture. This was my attempt to combine all these things together.
Yeah, and you do a great job of it. I think what I was trying to do in my book is to do this do this with American intelligence culture, but the problem you have with American intelligence culture is that the image you have of intelligence culture in America is of the science that is handed down from on high, fully formed, fleshed out, modeled after the hard sciences, let's be honest, but even though it's nominally the social sciences. Um, and there's no critical thought put into how this developed, why it developed, what purpose we put it to, and how accurate or valid it is in terms of the actual ways that people go about working intelligence. And what I try and do in my book is show the wide gap that's opened up between this self-image that the American intelligence world has created and the reality of what goes on inside the intelligence community. Um, do you feel do you feel, and here we're talking then about these core concepts of objectivity, timeliness, and non-politicization. To what extent are these real ontological realities? And to what extent are they the creations of generations of managers who are trying to structure and organize a very large apparatus with lots of employees and to try and corral this very secretive world in a very clear direction and give it guidelines and rules that are very firm and fixed for bureaucratic purposes?
Yeah, I think, it's a very tough issue. My own perspective, I'm developing it, is that it is the construct of people, its ontological existence or uh, status really depends on the people creating it. And let me just give you an example of something um, I discovered in my first book. I'm now, by the way, writing my second book about Israeli strategic and intelligence culture prior to October 7th and after. And I want to mention just one issue, Joshua, which relates to what you mentioned, um, which is how culture is something in between ideas and action. And I think what I found out in Israeli intelligence, and I haven't any specific example of this of American intelligence, but perhaps you know of such examples. I've seen something phenomena which strategic culture scholars call, and I was inspired here by one of my mentors, Professor Jamie Johnson, Utah University. They call it a gap between aspirational norms and realized behavior. In Israeli intelligence, for example, tragically, the aspirational norms of contrarian thinking, critical thinking, moral courage in the face of hierarchy, pluralism, these were the aspirational norms. Everyone spoke about these aspirational norms. Everyone, I believe, truly and authentically aimed for these norms to be manifest in practice. But as we know from October 7th, the realized behavior, all of these or most of these were absent. And I think the culture is not just the aspirational norms and not just the realized behavior, but the combination of them, or in this specific case, the gap between them. So, for example, you mentioned politicization, which I believe in American political culture and intelligence culture is one of the most dramatic traumas and one of the most dominant issues in intelligence culture research. In Israel, the practitioners, at least that I interviewed, felt rather comfortable that politicization is not really the a dramatic phenomenon of Israel. But I think this is changing now in the last 2 years. It is changing. Now, it is not changing just like you take this, computer mouse and move this. It is changing as a social construct. In hindsight, in 2027 or 2028, we might be able to say 3 or 4 years ago, this phenomenon took place. And by the way, I don't know if you've had the same challenges. When you go into the world of constructivism, there are many caveats. Perhaps you've also encountered some people who challenge you and told you, if everything is culture, then nothing is culture. It's a good point. It's a good point.
Okay, great. Then what we have here is a problem in strategic culture that's not really discussed in the literature, but it's something that we both experience in our respective worlds, in Israel and in America. Uh, and 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 this is really important. So what we have is a level of intelligence culture that is carefully crafted, shaped by people who are in a position of authority to do that. The people who are writing the textbooks, the people who are running the organizations, the people who are in charge of training, etc. Um, and then there is a real living culture, the way that practitioners experience their jobs on a day-to-day basis. In the case that we have in America, what I write in the book is you have a culture of scientism that tries to stamp out subjectivity at every turn. And yet, what I argue and I show in case studies time and time again is that the people who are most successful at communicating and accomplishing good analysis are the people who work outside that box and delve into their subjectivity in order to craft a narrative that speaks to an audience. And without that, then you're dealing with a different type of intelligence failure that's not discussed in any of the literature. It's a gap created by our blind spot, a blind spot that is a bias that we have towards science here in America. Okay, so there is so then where do these two levels diverge? What causes this split? I would argue in an American context that and I think you do a bit of this in your book as well, quite a bit of it actually. I would argue that this drive towards science in an American intelligence context plays into a larger American cultural context.
Yes.
This expectation that Americans have that their government should be open, accountable, transparent, but also humble, that there should be an element of humility in the way the government behaves and directness. And when the government doesn't behave in those ways, that's when you have scandal. That's when you have a public scandal that the American public can rally around and be angry about. That the intelligence community, in order to get the budget it wants from Congress, in order to get the resources it requires, in order to have the leeway to do the things it wants to do in terms of permissions to engage in the type of activities it wants to engage in, it needs the support of the American public, or at least their representatives on Capitol Hill. And to do that, the intelligence community has to play into a certain sense of Americanness
Mm.
that Americans have, and so you have trauma, you have experiences like 9/11 or the failure of WMD in Iraq, you have experiences like Pearl Harbor, etc. These form our language of intelligence failure, and we use them not just as examples of what went wrong, but as examples of how the intelligence community buckled down, learned its
Mm.
lessons, came back from behind, admitted its failings, and improved itself with greater and better science. Okay? They form a narrative that connects the intelligence community in a manner of humility and directness to the American people. Okay? Um, and the answer to each of these traumas is to double down with more science. The answer to bad science is more science.
More science.
More science. So then, okay, there's a purpose and a value in a broader cultural context in America for the way that the U.S. intelligence community defines itself. I just throw that out there as a thought.
No,
I'm
I
sure you
think
have reactions to that.
first of all, I don't see myself as an expert on American intelligence culture. I just try to compare the Israeli one a little bit to the American, to the British one. But I fully agree with what you say, Americanness and the American scientism. And by the way, I remember there's a great video of there was Michael Hayden from the CIA and NSA, the agency. I think it's from 7 or 8 years ago. It's like a TEDx lecture. Fascinating. He describes what happens, in the Oval Office with the president. Then he gets a little bit to what I found a fascinating philosophical discussion of intelligence. And he explicitly mentions that intelligence is the continuation of the Enlightenment. So it's, Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, and then all the way to the beginning of the 21st century. I think this is a very deep thought. Again, the culture I was educated upon is a different. But I think, first of all, it's fascinating that you have, such a unique personality really discussing into the philosophy. If you see yourself as a continuation of Emmanuel and the Enlightenment, scientism, clear thought. And you connect this, I think, with the American approach of, again, of an open democracy. I think it's no coincidence that American intelligence agencies publish, you know, some of their intelligence assessment, that I see senior leaders testify before the Congress. In Israel, these things are inconceivable. Nothing of this happens. Also because Israel has a different, yes.
Well, see, and again, it goes back to my point about American intelligence culture. What is the scandal we have right now? It's James Comey, it's John Brennan. What is the administration doing when it releases these documents and these people have to respond in New York Times op-eds? It is trying to show that these individuals are arrogant.
Yes.
It is trying to show their lack of humility. That is how the system has broken down in the public narrative, in the American people's mind's eye. That's like a greater crime than an actual intelligence failure in a sense, right? That creates more headlines, more paper, and more back and forth in the media than anything else, frankly, about intelligence in America.
Yes. And even more so, again, I don't want to discuss American politics. This is beyond my payroll. But even now, these days, with the new DNI, accusing the Nick staff or other staff, some of the accusations are about tradecraft. She doesn't explicitly mention just that these, 2016 assessments were politicized. She mentions problems of tradecraft and scientism, of course, going hand in hand. So I fully agree with your perspective. Even I can tell you when I did, before doing a PhD in intelligence studies, I did an MBA. And even the Israeli approach to MBA studies, business is very different from the American one. Even if you look at the concept of strategy, ends, ways, and means, this is very structured. I'm not judging it, but this is one approach. I rely so much on the book Program Safari Strategy. Strategy Safari. It's amazing books about 12 schools for strategy in the business sector, but it so much applies to the national security sector. And the American schools are what they call the visionary school or the strategic plan. Israeli political culture and Israeli culture writ large is much more chaotic, it's much more, much less organized. I think, by the way, Josh, I don't know if you would agree with me about broader institutional bureaucratic issues. I think American institutions, not just intelligence institutions, sometimes judge quality of a product through how much was the process rigorous, structured, organized. Look, if you read the publications of American think tanks, it's amazing. No one in Israel writes. The Israeli perception, again, writ large, okay, we're generalizing, judges the quality of the intelligence product, of the political product, of the strategic product based on the outcome.
Mm.
And now, again, I'm generalizing, but Israelis pay very, less attention to the rigorousness of the process in political processes and strategic processes, let alone in intelligence processes. And I can tell you, for overseeing intelligence products for more than 2 decades, and I'm also doing this now in my reserve service. It is so rare to find an analytical product where you can actually identify a structured process in Israel. So rare.
I mean, like, okay, on the American side, there's this over the years. There's been this increasing drive to apply methodologies, and
Yes.
and you have to, if you're going to do that, you tend to include some sort of paragraph at the end talking about the methodology itself. What process did you go through? What red cell teaming exercise did you do? What's SAT did you apply to your process? Whatever. Frankly, you talk to the people who do these things, the analysts, the actual analysts who actually do these things. sometimes they're interested in it in sort of an intellectual sense. There was an interesting intellectual exercise to go through. More often than not, they loathe the idea of having to do this,
Really?
but they're kind of checking off a box, or they were asked to do it, or as a team, they decided, it would be a valuable exercise to go through, or, a manager, whatever. There are a lot of different reasons that people do these things, but more often than not, you find people have a good spirit towards doing it. They have goodwill in making the effort. But is that the analysis? No, most people who engage in these things don't look at that as the analysis. The analysis is the point you're trying to make on top of all that methodology you've been asked to apply. I even had one person who was a manager at one point tell me, "Yeah, the only time we do SATs really are when I've got two analysts that can't agree on anything, and all they're doing is yelling at each other. So I tell them to go into a quiet corner and do an SAT just to get them to stop being angry. I have no interest in seeing the outcome of the SAT. I just want to see them stop fighting." I had one manager tell me that once. I thought it was really insightful.
But still, I think it's very interesting because what you're describing is that, at the field level, people you mentioned low the SATs, but you have these intelligence community directives, these ICDs, and you have the doctrine, and you have the level of probabilities, or what the Brits call the uncertainty yardstick, 0 to 30%. So I think it's an interesting question because, earlier I mentioned in Israel intelligence, I mentioned the gap between aspiration norms and realized behavior in a completely different, aspect relating specifically to an intelligence failure. But I think what's interesting, what you're now mentioning is that the managers of the intelligence community, and, in strategic culture research, some critical thoughts say culture is, I don't believe in this approach, but say culture is uh, decided or formulated by senior leadership. They decide. I have a different approach. But the senior leadership of the USIC, as you described, still looks very high on SATs and tradecraft and methodology and scientism. And I can tell you I mentioned to you when I teach in American universities, this is very dominant of the curriculum. But what is the reason, or what is the explanation you find to this gap between these, at least as far as the senior managers in the USIC describe its aspiration norms, but the realized behavior so different. But this realized behavior, as you describe it, does not really change these aspirational norms.
Okay, so that's one set of questions. There's another set of questions in strategic culture that I don't feel are answered adequately in the literature. It's a very obvious and simple one, yet it's something that it would be hard to do for anyone to do, frankly. It's a question about how much of intelligence culture is a product of the local society and how much of it is inherent in the profession itself. How much of it is common to any intelligence agency anywhere in the world, and how much of it is very localized. And I just want to say, I've interacted with a bunch of different intelligence, agencies from around the world in my career, and from very large organizations to very small organizations to countries that only had basically one intelligence
Hmm.
agency that did everything, and a very small manned agency at that, right? And and I when you talk to the working level people, my experience is I encounter the same frustrations, the same dysfunctional breakdowns, but also the same collaborative spirit um, around the world. And I hear a lot of the same stories, even from the very tiniest of countries and agencies. I hear the same stories from the analysts that I experienced in my career, which kind of shocks me when you realize that, because you think so much of what you experience is unique to the big bureaucracy that we have in Washington, and then you find out, oh, but someone halfway around the world who works for a tiny little agency that has only a few people. And it's even more interesting to do that cross comparison. It tells me that there are certain aspects of functionality and dysfunctionality within the profession that are inherent in the profession. They are not
Hmm.
tied down to the local culture of the country that you're in, but they are inherent in the profession itself. And they come from any organization that tries to hide sensitive data is going to inevitably end up in certain functionalities and dysfunctionalities as a result of that. Um, and so there's an argument to be made that there's something inherent in the intelligence any intelligence field anywhere, that there's certain aspects that pervade it. Where am I going with this? So then how do we separate out what is local, what is unique, what is cultural of that people or that nation, and what is within the profession?
I think, first of all, for me, for my research, do this cross comparison. First of all, from an academic's perspective, I try to compare my findings to the literature, but I also rely on so many of my experiences as a practitioner, the Americans with the British and with other, intelligence systems. I think it is very hard to differentiate, but I think I have slightly different perspective than yours. I think, of course, there are, generic issues such as cognitive biases and so forth. But my experience, at least based on my practical, engagement with Americans, very, very large portion, I think, of the intelligence practice is influenced by social aspects, by local, by cultural aspects. I can tell you, for example, um, um, the issue of, for example, the distance between intelligence and decision. And again, when we speak about intelligence culture, we overgeneralize. But in the US intelligence culture, and I think also in the strategic culture, there should be some separation. In the Israeli intelligence culture, it's completely the opposite. By the way, one of the issues I will discuss in my new book, I think this was also one of the factors for the colossal intelligence failure of October 2023. The commanding officers, the political leadership, and the intelligence officers all held the same law, of course, analytical paradigm. Intelligence officers in Israel saw their role first and foremost as influencing policy and operations. But commanding officers read raw intelligence and analyzed raw intelligence as if they were intelligence analysts.
Mm.
But what I wanted to mention is that in my encounter with intelligence, I'm telling you just anecdotes. There are some sentences I've heard lots of times from others which have no translation to Hebrew. They do not exist in Hebrew. For example, when we Israelis would constantly speak with our American counterparts, and then we would say, okay, but what does that have? What will happen to this? So there's a sentence in English, in American English. It's a matter of policy. It's a matter of downtown. These sentences they have no translation in Hebrew.
Mm.
When Mossad director or Shabak director or IDI director traveled to the US, and I discuss this in my book, they traveled not just to discuss intelligence, they traveled to influence US policy. And so I think that, and as you mentioned, many issues are generic, but the interaction between intelligence and decision making is so very dependent on local culture. The approach towards intelligence theory, uh, again, I think Americans, British maybe even more so, but Americans value intelligence theories of intelligence and theories about intelligence. And the sentence that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. So the joke is that Israelis say in theory, this sentence is correct. In practice, cares about, intelligence theory. The issue of the process is, I think, what is the process of intelligence is so determined by local factors. So I think, and naturally I'm biased, since I studied intelligence culture. Every year, there was a song, I think, of Australian band. Everywhere you go, you always take the weather. So everywhere I go, I always see local intelligence culture. I am biased. I think that many factors very much dependent on local issues. And one thing I try to do, and perhaps we will have a chance to discuss this a bit later, it's not really studying its strategic culture, and it is definitely not studying intelligence culture research. Issue on changing culture. Culture constantly changes. And I try to focus on two issues. First of all, the influence of failure, trauma. The second, my favorite topic, which is ultra constructivist competition for dominance between subcultures. Of course, such competition is always implicit. It's never implicit. You cannot find articles about this. You cannot find people say, I adopt this subculture and I compete with that subculture. In the US, I see, by the way, and again, I'm not an expert to US intelligence culture, not really sure what such competition looked like in last years. In Israel, there was a competition, and I think one subculture had the upper hand. The subculture uh, highlighting election operations, raw information, conciseness, jointness, and of course, innovation. While the other subculture, more traditional one, the one highlighting strategic intelligence, the one highlighting ambiguity and vagueness, has been put aside. And by the way, now I think it's another competition for dominance between subcultures. I find this a fascinating topic in intelligence culture research, but also in strategic culture research.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and there's one last question I think I'd like to ask because it really does highlight the divide between an intelligence culture like yours and an intelligence culture like ours. And it's this concept of intuition. Because in the American literature, the concept of intuition is it's what do you call it? It's a convenient excuse to talk about science. Nobody
Yes.
actually defines intuition. There's no definition of it given in the US literature. It's this idea that in the old days, we used to do things by feel and we don't do them that way anymore. It's antiquated, it's out of date, it is leading to failure. Now we have
Ideal.
science. We're in the Enlightened era. We are now all pursuing the Enlightenment project with Kant and Adorno and whoever else. And Max Horkheimer. So this idea of intuition doesn't actually exist except as a straw man. Okay, in all of the American literature on intelligence studies, and in practitioners' world and everything. And yet, it strikes me as ridiculous because there is a philosophical tradition for intuition. There are
Yes.
philosophers that have built whole careers, like Emmanuel Levinas, on the idea of intuition. Husserl devotes chapter after chapter to this idea of intuition, right? And in those writings, there is a true validity and there's a value to this concept that is at its core essential for intelligence work, as far as I can see it. It seems to me that what these philosophers were describing in an intelligence context is they're trying to describe the moment of insight, the
Mhm.
moment when the subject that you're studying is no longer a set of reports on your computer screen, but it becomes something three-dimensional that you can put
Mhm.
yourself in the shoes of the subject, the target set that you're studying, which is what we ultimately want as analysts. We want to understand the intentions and motivations of the actors that are targeting, right? But to get to that point, you have to be able to step beyond the computer screen, beyond the two-dimensional portraits that you get transmitted to you that have been through 5, 6, 7 layers of handling and processing before they've arrived at your desk. And that moment of insight where you cross that barrier and you can actually put yourself in the shoes of the people you're studying and understand their motivations and intentions. That's what all these philosophers are describing as intuition. They're describing that moment of intuition as you have fully grasped the topic. It is no longer an object out in space. It is part of your world that you now occupy, and you can move around in. And that doesn't exist in the American intelligence literature. It is anathema. It is the exact opposite of what the American intelligence culture is trying to inculcate. So tell me what it's like in Israel. What is intuition?
Yeah. The issues you mentioned are fascinating, and I think I would just add, to your discussion of intuition, um, tacit knowledge. Michael Polanyi and the issue of tacit knowledge in the Israeli intelligence culture writ large. I think it is almost the complete other extreme. I can tell you from my studies, but also this is how I grew up. This is how I raised. You raised, not really raised,
Yeah.
educated. Everything is intuition. There is nothing beyond intuition. Nothing more is needed beyond intuition. So I think the Israelis, and again, I'm overgeneralizing, But I can tell you when I tried, I was deputy head of the analysis for the IDI, and I was naive. I tried to apply some SATs. And I remember the young and the middle-aged analysts, which were amazing. They told me, what do we need these, structured and war games and backcasting? I think the Israeli approach, by the way, intuition is gained not through reading academic texts. No way. It is gained through combat experience.
Mm.
By the way, my own approach is that there is something in between, intuition and scientism. But I think the Israeli intelligence culture admires or adores intuition and sees these SATs and scientists' approaches as, first of all, they're boring, cumbersome, and who knows what will happen with them. I can tell you one time, and I'll just finish with that. I gave a lecture at some sort of training, a junior analyst, and we discussed should we do a war game about Hezbollah and Nasrallah? It was 5 or 6 years ago, and they told me a war game. What new knowledge would we create through a war game? We know Nasrallah, and I told them, look, of course, we're not getting to too much philosophy. The fact that you know Nasrallah for the last 20 years does not really mean that you will know what Nasrallah would. For example, 2018, when Israel revealed the underground town of Lebanon to Israel. And again, the Israeli approach is that nothing more is needed beyond intuition. I think this is too extreme. It's a very, therefore, who has the best intuition? The experienced analyst with experience in the field, not academia, not in academia. This is the Israeli approach, whether you like it or not. And again, I'm overgeneralizing, okay? It's not so extreme, but it is rather extreme.